was going to say, I think probably a great place to start is by introducing Maeve. So guys, well, I'll introduce me. My name is Claire Barnett. I work for the Frist Center for Autism and Innovation. And this is Maeve. She's a miniature Aussie doodle. She'd like me to put her down so she can take a nap. But she's been trained to remind me at the right times of day to take my medicine, which makes her a service animal. And a lot of times we could have a whole webinar about service animals for people with non-obvious disabilities, because that can be a challenge at times. But Maeve is brilliant and she makes my life a whole lot easier. So if anyone has questions actually about service animals, that is something you could email me and ask. Okay, I was hoping to have Emory Hall, a Vanderbilt undergrad, join us as well and talk about how they decided to transition as part of this panel from female pronouns to they, them, and he, him. Although it looks like we may not have Emory joining us today. We'll see if they're able to log on later in the webinar, but something came up there. So we do have with us Rachel Barcelona coming from Florida. Rachel is a college student in Florida and an autistic advocate who Rachel, it seems like I hear your name every time I turn around because you're involved in some new initiative and speaking up about the things that people on the autism spectrum can do, which is really empowering. So I'm glad you're here, Rachel. I've also got Lauren Melissa here with me today. Lauren is known on Instagram under, I think I'm pronouncing it right, but Audinell. No?
Autianel.
Autianel. Okay. Well, see, now I'm glad I asked. But I had been following your Instagram advocacy, Lauren, for months before I thought I should reach out and see if she'd like to participate in one of our recorded events. So I'm really glad that you were able to join us for this one and give your perspective on being an autistic woman. And then we've got Lydia and then XZ Brown from the Autistic Women Non-Binary Network. So Lydia is going to speak a little bit about their experiences and those of their organization. I'm very excited about this. What I'm going to start with, though, is just a couple of slides that sort of introduce this topic and get the conversation started. And one of the great things about the fact that we've only got about 10 participants along with us is that we can have a conversation. We can answer your questions. And if you have any scenarios that you've been in, a family member's been in, and you want to say, like, what would you have done here? Or, you know, what's the best way to approach this and still support somebody well? Or that is something that we can do when we have a smaller group. So that's kind of exciting. All right, I'm going to screen share the slides I've got. Chances are, if you decided to join today, you have some familiarity already with the idea that gender can really impact someone's experience of being on the autism spectrum. But just in case you don't have a lot of background, I'm going to provide just a little bit and sort of start the conversation, getting you thinking about what does it mean to be non-binary or a woman on the spectrum? How can that be really different than the very traditional male experience of being autistic? Oh, and another really important thing to say here is that all of our panelists and myself are autistic. We are proud to be a part of this community. And that's why we want to share our perspectives with you. It's firsthand. Okay. If you have any questions while I go through a little bit of this information, feel free to put it in the chat or even unmute since we're so small today. Okay. Lots of information here. There is not enough research out there, like at all, on gender diversity, gender fluidity, and the LGBT community and that overlap with neurodiversity and autism. And so while I was able to find one really great study that lent a little bit of the information here, I wish I had as many slides on being non-binary or being LGBT and that part of the autistic population, because there's not enough out there for me to have filled 5 more slides the way I did with some experience about the women's versus men's experiences. But this is a really important place to start, because when we talk about gender, you have to recognize that while, you know, a majority of people will identify as male or female, a lot of people don't. And a higher percentage of the autistic population, and that's what this one really great study found, a higher percentage of the autistic population identifies as either non-binary, transgender, or just LGBTQ, even if their gender identity falls under male or female, they may belong to the LGBT community in another way. So the experience of being neurodivergent and gender diverse or LGBT is really complex. There's a lot of intersectionality there. And I think hopefully we're going to have a little bit of insight on that in the panel, because this is an area too where I continue to learn from my fellow autistic people from their experiences and to learn the best ways to support them as they navigate a place where a lot of times there is compounding marginalization, which is unfortunate, but it's something we have to recognize in order to improve. So like I said, not enough research on this, but we want to keep in mind that you cannot lump someone who is non-binary just into, well, they were assigned female at birth or assigned male, because it's a really different experience. While there may be some similarities as I talk about more of the traditional female experience of being autistic, and this might also be something that our panelists can add on to, it should be a category of its own in terms of study and how we think about and support those people. So let's talk about this slightly more traditional, these categories of male and female, because while we have tons of individuals who don't identify as male or female, we have a lot who do. And the majority of folks are going to say that they identify more with male or more with female. And so that affects your socialization. It affects the way that your parents raise you, that your community treats you. And, you know, unfortunately, even some people who identify as non-binary are sort of pigeonholed into a socialization of male or female. But let's talk about the people who do say they identify more with one of those two groups and thus are socialized as part of it. Studies and anecdotal patterns both show that males and females typically have really distinct presentations and personal experiences of neurodiversity. So gender affects the perception as well of these conditions, which means it can be a different diagnostic process. It can be a different disclosing process. It can be different in just the way you talk about it or the symptoms that your friends and family notice. The why behind this remains to be researched and proven, but there are a couple of questions that we're going to think about that I think point us sort of in the correct direction. And this is my hypothesis, right? But you guys can offer your own voices and tell me, like, does this ring true for you or not? So how are boys/men and girls/women traditionally socialized differently? And how are they typically perceived and treated differently from childhood through adulthood? And I think these questions lead to a lot of the differences we see in female identifying and male identifying, especially once they get to adulthood, autistic people. Okay, so let's think about female socialization for a minute. Girls from, you know, babies on, I mean, toddler age and beyond, are taught to be friendly, social, smiley, attractive and well-dressed, accommodating and cooperative, emotionally expressive, nurturing, organized, detail-oriented caretakers. I'm not saying all of this socialization is a good thing or these are the things girls have to do, but I'm saying that particularly in the US and a lot in the South where I'm from, these are the things that women are expected to get better and better at. These are the feminine qualities that are desirable to raise a young woman to have. A lot of this learning is done by just observing other women and girls. And I want you to imagine, and there's an ADHD example down here too, because we can think about this broadly in terms of other kinds of neurodiversity. But if an autistic girl is frequently encouraged to be more social, that she needs to fit in, she needs to explore her emotions, what symptoms might that mask of autism? And, you know, the answer I reached here with this hypothetical was, well, if she has been encouraged that the most important thing in the world is to learn, you know, a script for having brief social interactions, a script for small talk, that may cover up the fact that she naturally doesn't understand small talk, wasn't very good at it, that every time she meets a new person, she repeats that same script. If she's encouraged to do anything to fit in, that may cover up some of the more obvious symptoms that we may see in boys, like acting out or presenting themselves, you know, let's say, because they're encouraged to be so independent, maybe they want to dye their hair green. And the fact that they want to do that, even though the other kids think it's strange, might be an indicator to a teacher, to a parent, like, oh, their brain's working really differently. And girls that are encouraged to look like other girls are not going to always stand out, even when on the inside, they want to be expressing themselves in a different way. And even that exploring their emotions, I think a lot of times women on the autism spectrum are told, even if identifying your own emotions and determining other people's and interactions is really hard, even if it's not natural, you have to get good at it. You have to figure out some coping mechanism, some hack to do that. Even if you don't do it super well, you have to put in tons of hours of work on it, or else you're not meeting our expectations as someone being socialized as a woman. And so I found upon receiving my own diagnosis that while I had pretty decent, reading other people's emotions, for example. It was something I had worked incredibly hard at. When I relayed my thought process and the way that I had worked for years to figure it out, other people were like, oh, that came naturally. So that covers up a symptom. And then when we look to the ADHD example, if a younger girl is taught that, organizing, cleaning, that's women's work, you got to behave like a lady, that can mask things like executive functioning difficulty, because maybe she comes up with all these strategies to do all the little things she's expected to, even though it's really, really difficult. Or, a lot of boys get diagnosed because they end up acting out and doing impulsive or hyperactive things. And socialization can pressure a girl that you have to sit still, even if everything in you is saying not to. So hopefully we're following along with this idea. And hopefully for those of you who were socialized as women, a lot of this sounds familiar. Hopefully not all of it, a lot of it's old fashioned, but unfortunately, a lot of it is familiar to us. And then if we compare that to male socialization, and this is just the other half of the coin that I want to kind of get you thinking about before we launch into our conversation. Men are more often taught that they can be stoic or distant, that they're supposed to be critical thinkers, independent, intelligent, tough or aggressive, that they're supposed to be really task focused. So if you imagine a boy who is born and he's on the spectrum and he's encouraged to be independent and assertive, what symptoms might that bring to the surface? And you think about not naturally having excellent social skills, like a little bit of social confusion or anxiety, that is going to come out if a boy who's in kindergarten or first grade is interacting with his peers in an unusual way. When you think more on the executive function side, because as many as 80% of autistic people also qualify for an ADHD diagnosis, think about this boy who's instructed to be assertive and focus on his strengths. What symptoms of ADHD might that highlight? And here I was thinking about this idea that so if you are really, really focused on your strengths and on doing what you're good at, you are much more likely, I think, to have your weaknesses pop up as well, because you're saying, I'm not doing that thing at all because I'm bad at it. And then a parent or a teacher is going to identify a pattern there and say, oh, these weaknesses fit the challenges that come with autism. Versus a lot of times, I think women are less encouraged to zero in on their strengths and use them, and more encouraged to just accommodate, do what's needed, caretake for others. So, like I said, a lot of what I'm doing here is matching a little bit of research out there with the observations and anecdotal evidence I've gathered as an autistic woman and a person working at an autism research center who's met a lot of self-advocates. But there's some patterns here that I wanted to point out, and I wanted to sort of get my panel's opinion on. And so this is our last slide before we jump into a discussion, but let's talk about the connection to the way, especially men and women on the spectrum, are perceived. The socio-emotional expectations are lower for men than for women, just in general. So all women being taught to assess and meet others' expectations, where men are taught to embrace their own instincts and act independently, means that women are more likely to blend in with other women, even when internally their brain is wired differently. Their senses are being perceived differently. They're doing everything in their power to fit in, where men are taught to embrace their differences and let them show. So I think that is one of the reasons neurodivergent women are frequently perceived by clinicians as like not quite there. They don't quite meet the diagnosis. The diagnostic criteria, though, and this is a flaw, are a lot of times based just on these studies of boys and men. So they're not even taking into account the experiences of women or non-binary people. And I think this is one explanation for why women or non-binary people are likely to go undiagnosed till later in life or never be diagnosed at all. Also, we have found that when women disclose, especially if they have spent a whole lifetime masking, they're likely to be perceived as less legitimate. People wonder if they're faking it or if someone misdiagnosed them instead of just accepting it. So those are Claire's observations. Hopefully, they follow as logical and they get you thinking about what directions this conversation could go in. But you have to bear in mind, I guess, to take these observations with a grain of salt and to apply your own experiences and interpretations, because they are not the end all be all on this. We do need more research. So I'm going to stop my screen share. And I would love for each of our panelists to tell the group a little bit more about who they are and what they kind of have to offer perspective wise to this panel. And then there's a couple of questions I want to ask you guys, and then we'll see if our audience that's joined us this evening, which by the way, thanks for spending Friday evening with us. If you guys have any questions to ask, and those can be direct message to me, they can be asked in the group chat or they can be asked out loud. But let's go to Rachel first, because you're first on my screen over here. If you want to introduce yourself.
I don't exactly know how to do it, but I'll just say hi. My name's Rachel. I'm an autism self-advocate, and I'm just really happy to be here. Usually someone else does it, and I'm good at following someone else, so I don't know.
Got it. Well, let me tell you guys where I first met Rachel. 2 years ago this week, actually, no, 2 years ago next week. I was at the United Nations World Autism Awareness Day event, which I want to say was on April 2nd. So it might have been 2 years ago today. Yeah, because it was on the 2nd that year. Because last year it wasn't supposed to be. But anyway, Rachel was a part of one of the panels speaking at the UN. So if that gives you any idea of the platforms she's spoken to, but I remember thinking that I identified with a lot of the things you said, Rachel. And then after, I was at an Italian restaurant and you and your mom walked in and sat down across the restaurant and I waved. So I feel certain you don't remember that, but I remember thinking it was a funny coincidence that the person I'd been most interested in hearing speak ended up at the same restaurant for lunch. Anyway, Rachel, we're excited to have you here. Lauren, do you want to add anything about yourself?
And yeah, I think the question was like to say something about myself and maybe what I can contribute to this conversation. And yeah, so I'm Lauren Melissa, also known as AutiNL, and I am a social justice influencer, is what I like to say, and an advice columnist. I think in regards to conversations about gender and autism, I'm not going to go too much into it because I know we have questions on board, but I think that I have things to offer into this conversation, not only as a woman who was diagnosed late in life, but also as a Black woman who has been socialized in that way and has also experienced different kinds of prejudices in the medical industry as a Black queer woman.
Thank you, Lauren. And there, I merely put a slide in at the end about how these things also overlap with other types of intersectionality. And then I thought, no, I'll just let my panelists talk about it because you guys represent such diverse groups here. But thank you. Okay, Lydia, it's your turn. Anything else you want to say about who you are or what you have to offer perspective-wise to the panel?
This is Lydia. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a youngish East Asian person with short black hair and glasses. Today, I'm wearing a red shirt for Walk in Red for Autism Acceptance Day, and it's the shirt that says, organizing autistic people is like herding cats. I'm also wearing a pin that says there's no wrong way to have a body. I currently wear many hats, and one of them is that I work with the Autistic Women Non-Binary Network as their director, of policy, advocacy, and external affairs. Another is that I am the founding director of the Fund for Community Reparations for Autistic People of Color's Interdependent Survival and Empowerment. And another is that, like all of us in this pandemic, I am very, very tired. So I know that we all share that. My work for the last 10 years has been as a community organizer, advocate, policy person, and a lot of other things. And my work is rooted and grounded in a practice of disability justice, which is very distinct from disability rights, although a lot of people don't necessarily know that and use the terms interchangeably, even though they are not actually the same thing. And what I'm most excited about tonight, if any of you would be so willing to oblige, is that if any of you have cats or dogs at home, I would really like to see them. Please share.
I love that. Well, I'd introduced Maeve at the beginning, and now she's under the bed taking a nap. So I'm going to leave her be, but absolutely adore my dog. Oh, I see a cute dog.
There's a beautiful pupper on screen. Hello, what a gorgeous doggo that is. Hi, what beautiful
Oh.
ears you have. What a wonderful face you have. You are bestest and I love you.
Caroline, I would like to steal that dog, please. If you could just send it to 309 Canton Stone. Never mind. All right.
Hi.
Please text me pictures of your flutes. I love it.
Oh, other gorgeous doggo.
Oh, Lauren, what kind is your pup?
I just got her. She's a rescue. She's an Akita Japanese Spitz mix.
I was going to say, that's not the type you see so often. So we've got Samson, and then what's your dog's name?
Farron.
Hi, Farron.
I woke her up.
You're wonderful.
Okay.
Go on, sweetie.
Well, this has really been a mood booster. My first question for the panel. So let's transition from puppies to gender. Two lovely topics to talk about though on a Friday evening. I want to know from you guys what your experience was of determining your own gender identity, the pronouns that you felt you wanted to use, and if sexuality was a part of that, you can bring it into the conversation, although you're under no obligation to. I want to know what your experience has been in terms of like assigned this gender at birth, but I found that these pronouns or this gender or this experience was really what resonated with me more. And if you want to add in how you think being autistic related, you can, although I'm going to follow up a little bit with a different question. So just your experience of finding your own gender identity. And let's see, Rachel, would you like to start again?
Yeah, okay. Like I said, I'm a little bit nervous because it's all been very new to me. Like you told me that I was socialized doing stereotypically feminine things like pageants, and they have the rules like you have to be a natural born woman to compete and this, that, and the third. But ever since I was 5, I hated dresses. I get gender dysphoria wearing them, getting my hair done, getting my nails done, and all that stuff. And I don't really tell anyone that. So just talking about this is huge for me. And I came out recently. Nobody knows but my parents. So it's really, really big. It's like my identity was there, but it took me a whole lifetime just to get to it. And I think autism did play a big part in it.
Wow. Oh my gosh. Thank you for sharing so much about your experience. I'm glad you feel comfortable sharing that with us too, because we're kind of a small group and it's not an overwhelming place to start talking about it. So tell us about your pronouns, Rachel. Which ones do you prefer and why?
Well, that's all of them, she, they, and they, because I'm whatever I wish to be, and that's okay. But everyone is a little confused about the last one, and it's a neo-pronoun, and I love it because it's Celtic in origin, and my grandma would always tell me stories about the Fae, and it's power for me to identify with such a beautiful creature that's not fully human. So yeah,
Yeah, I was reading about it when I learned about your pronouns, and I read that Fae was a neo-pronoun and that it evoked the idea of being not entirely human, like part fairy. And it sort of is a spiritual connection to that idea. Would you say I'm right, or am I misrepresenting that somehow?
No, I think that it's perfect, and you should just walk around and own whatever you think fits you. And I mean, who cares what anyone has to say?
I love how confident you are as you say that, because I've thought the same things and then I've been self-conscious about them. But you say that with a huge smile on your face. So you're encouraging me. Lauren, would you like to tackle that question next of how did you figure out what your gender identity really was and if it matched what you were assigned at birth and just sort of that journey?
Yeah, so for me, I think that my gender exploration was honestly cut pretty short at a very young age. I am AFAB and I do identify as a woman and I use pronouns she, her. But my gender was never a very easy thing for me to grasp and understand, especially around the time of puberty. And when I remember specifically in 8th grade, I would think constantly about how I didn't identify with being a girl, and I felt much closer to being a feminine man. And that was something that I was working through, but it was shut down very early on from my parents. Like, because I would like collect pictures of people who I felt like were my gender representation, and that was very disturbing to my parents. So I kind of just was dealing with so many other things, with bullying, with queerness, in terms of sexual identity, that I think I just put that on the back burner and told myself that that was something that I couldn't handle right now. Like I was already trying to work through too many things. And then by the time I reached college age, I started to use gender norms as a way of trying to relate to other people and mask and get through socialization. And now here I am today, a decade later. And I think at this point, she, her is just where I'm comfortable, but that doesn't necessarily reflect my actual like feelings of gender within myself, regardless of what my pronouns are.
Well, and Lauren, you highlight something really important there. That is, well, a lot of people settle for like, okay, this is how I was socialized, this is how I was raised, this is what I'm told I'm supposed to do. And they're like, well, it's not exactly wrong. It never, for some folks, it doesn't always feel right either. And you don't get into that until you ask somebody. I mean, tell me about your gender identity. So thank you for telling us about how you ended up identifying as she, her, but how there's sort of more to you than that in terms of your own experience of gender. And Lydia, please jump in here. It is your turn, so long as you're ready, to tell us about your own experience figuring out what gender you identified with.
This is Lydia. I was actually raised in a fundamentalist evangelical church and community, and that's not a community that is very well known for being accepting or open to people who are not cisgender or heterosexual. And so for me, it didn't even occur to me that I wasn't cisgender or heterosexual until after I went to college. But once I began to think about the possibility that I wasn't what everyone, including myself, had assumed I was, a lot of things made much more sense. Referring to myself as a girl or a woman had never felt right, like in the same way as putting on clothing that literally just doesn't fit you. For me, it wasn't a feeling of instant rejection of this feels gross or bad, so much as this just feels incorrect. It does not fit me. And everyone has a different experience, right? So some people experience very intense dysphoria, and some people experience little to no dysphoria based on assumptions about what gender they were assumed to be and expected to be from childhood. I've experienced something that's kind of in the middle, right? And I think a lot of us are in that in-between space. It didn't feel disgusting to be called a girl or a woman. It just didn't feel right. And by the same token, if someone ever called me a boy, that also just didn't feel right. Also didn't feel disgusting, but it didn't feel good and it didn't feel correct. But there were signs throughout my childhood that there were ways in which I had always embraced many aspects of femininity as well as masculinity and rejected many elements and conventions of both femininity and of masculinity. And there were points at which I thought of myself as more feminine. There have been points at which I thought of myself as more masculine. And where I am now is I think of myself as not really having a gender at all. So there are different words that I use to describe what that is. Sometimes I say that I am agender or genderless, but more often I'll just say that I'm a non-binary trans person because that's easier to say and it covers a broader and a wider variety of experiences. And I use that terminology because it places me in conversation with people who are trans and experience their own genders in very different ways as well. It is a way of establishing connection or community. And it is true as to who I am. And so if I say that I am trans or that I am queer, it is the same way that I might say I'm East Asian. Those are all terms of political and cultural significance that mean a lot to me. but I could also be more specific than that if I chose to be, if I wanted to detail more specifically that I am an genderqueer person, and that my gender and my queerness are inextricably interconnected with each other, and that I don't really have a gender as understood by white colonizing understandings of the gender binary. And that can be really hard to explain to other people, like especially if I don't know them that well, where I might not have a problem with saying that, but do I really want to spend the next 45 minutes explaining what that means? Probably not. There was a period in my adult life where I went by both they and she pronouns, and that's a common experience too for a lot of people who are socially transitioning in the trans community. Sometimes people will go through a point of their life where they will use more than one sets of pronouns, including the pronouns that have been assumed of them throughout childhood. Today, I go by they, them pronouns because that most accurately reflects where I am within the constraints of the English language. In other languages, it might be something different. When I was in Iceland, I asked to be referred to with the pronoun that other non-binary people were using, hen. When I have been in Spanish-speaking contexts, I've asked to be referred to as ella, E-L-L-E, instead of either el or ella. And in other languages, there are no pronouns. In American Sign Language, there are not pronouns. In Mandarin, there are not pronouns. And so the use of pronouns to indicate, assume, or impute gender isn't universal. And it's very contextual on culture, geography, and language. So I don't even know that it's the right question for us to be focused on. I think it can be helpful perhaps to folks who might be listening to this and thinking through what makes sense to them. But I don't even know that it's the most helpful question for us to be focused on, because it is such a white-centric, English-centric conversation to be having.
Well, what a great segue, because what I want to ask about next is your experiences navigating the world as non-male identifying people who are autistic. So I really want to connect it more, because part of this is our first event for the Frist Center's Autistic Pride Month programming. And we really want to shift the conversation to elevating autistic voices instead of just the voices of parents or siblings or fundraising groups throughout the month of April. And so I want to know from each of my panelists, and this will be my last question for y'all before we move to any audience questions. As an autistic person who was not assigned male at birth and doesn't identify as male in the world, how do you think your experience has been different or has been affected by your gender? And so while the point is well taken and absolutely fascinating, that in some ways gender is not universal. I mean, there are countries where it's not as much of a center point. It is in the United States, and we can't change that overnight. So knowing that, each of you live here, and I think about my own experience as someone who has had in some ways the blessing of feeling really at home in the gender I was assigned. And while it was something, I thought about as conversations began to happen around the world about, oh, well, it's okay to consider your gender and to decide what you identify with, I found myself feeling really at home with female pronouns and traditional female presentation. And so in some ways, I think that spared me a lot of the challenge of trying to grapple with this and have other people understand it. But I also know that female experience means that when I disclose that I'm autistic, a lot of times people say, what did you say? Artistic? Like they can't, or they'll say, you don't look autistic. And I'm thinking, is that supposed to be a compliment? Because this is what autistic people look like. And also all the other ones are what autistic people look like. So yes, I would love to know y'all's experiences disclosing, getting diagnosed, and how you think gender may have played a role in those things. And we'll make our little loop again by going back to Rachel.
Well, that's a lot of information, but I mean, I've had a lot of experiences in this short time I've been trying to navigate who I am. And I mean, what's really helped me is talking to trans people, and I've never been happier just being in that community because I feel at home there. And the reason why is because I've identified as gay and bi-gender. I disclosed that fact to one of my doctors during a doctor appointment, and it was funny because he was like, "So does that mean you have both down there?" And I'm just like, "Yeah, how do you know?" I don't know. I just find the fact of terrifying people genuinely really awesome. I don't know, because you're going to get people that want to understand, and then some people you can't help. And this is why we need to use our voices, because we are powerful. We tend to make ourselves small because people think we are different. But we have to stop thinking that. We need to educate people, and I believe that we are going to make a difference.
Oh, Rachel, I love that you're not afraid to challenge people's preconceived notions. Would you say that there have been times that you were treated differently as someone who others perceived to just be a female? They probably didn't think past that, unfortunately. Do you think you've been treated differently because of that than people who they perceive to be male and on the spectrum?
Definitely, because a lot of people, they see autism as a male-centric disorder. So I've gotten the, "Oh, you don't look autistic" kind of thing. And I mean, God help them if we talk about identity, because that's when people usually shut me out. But I try my hardest. I want to be positive about it. And, eventually you'll find the people that are right for you, who will care about you, and they'll want to listen to you talk about gender politics all day.
Thank you, Rachel. All right, let's move on and get Lauren's perspective on this. I'll reiterate the question one more time, since it was kind of a lengthy one. Just how you think your own gender, as it's perceived by others, as it was assigned at birth, how has that affected your experience to have been getting a diagnosis or disclosing autism, and the way you think people have treated you?
So this question often causes me to fracture my identity and the way that I look at myself in many ways, because I think that my misdiagnosis in autism that went on for so long is both partially because of my gender, because of my socioeconomic status while growing up, and because of my race. So I think that all three of those things combined made it difficult for people to see me for who I am, instead of making assumptions about me or making determinations about me that I was doing well enough in certain areas, so they didn't need to look into other struggles and hardships that I encountered throughout my life. I'd say that from an early age, though, and this is common for many autistics who were socialized as girls, I was very quiet in class and a rule follower, and I was trying to just get along and get approval most of the time. And because of that, I mean, my teachers never had any complaints about me. And even as I struggled and struggled and struggled with my peers, I didn't really get anybody noticing those things. My mother, who raised me, she had a lot of mindsets that were also based in Christian gender roles. And so I was taught very strictly to do and behave in certain ways. And I also have an older sister. And my older sister was told to guide me along, and I was told to copy her. So I just kind of followed this mimicry throughout my whole life, not my whole life, but throughout my youth, my adolescence. And that caused a lot of, I think, missed opportunities for people to see the bullying that I was going through, see the struggles that I was going through. A lot of the bullying people chalked up to me being biracial and saying, "Oh, well, biracial people, like, they're not accepted by anybody, so that's why she's having such a hard time getting around or getting along." And that just marked my whole path. And I internalized those things about myself, that I wasn't trying hard enough to fit in and to be like everyone else, to be like other girls. I would study other girls. I would take notes. I had notebooks full of like rules and outfits and makeup tips and how to do my hair. And then when that didn't work, I started trying to take on another expression, and I became goth, scene, emo kid and tried to follow that expression of femininity because I was hoping that it would work out better for me. But of course, every clique has its rules. Every clique has what fits in, and I just never fit in those ways. Today, I think it still marks my experience. I don't allow it to as much, and I fight back a lot. But I definitely think when people meet me, they would never expect me to be autistic. I've been told by friends, colleagues, oh, don't worry, I would have never guessed. And that's a really painful thing to
The
hear.
fact that they think it's a compliment, though, is baffling. And it says so much about how we need to have more of these conversations, not just in April, but all year, about what it means to be autistic and a part of this community and to embrace the identity instead of it being like, oh, good news, nobody could tell. Anyway, thank you so much, Lauren. And then our last panelist to answer one of my prepared questions, Lydia, if you'd like to share a little bit about your own diagnosis, perception, and the connection to gender. And then if anyone in our audience has questions, feel free to put them in the chat now, and I'll just read them out to our panelists in the order I receive them.
This is Lydia. I actually want to go back to what you were just talking about, which is, I don't actually find it surprising or confusing at all that people think it is a compliment to say, but you don't look autistic, or but I couldn't tell. Because ableism teaches us that disability is a bad thing all the time, that all disability is undeniably and uncomplicatedly tragic and devastating and unfortunate, that all disability is evidence of lack of humanity or lack of personhood. So of course, societally, people are going to believe that it is a good thing to say, well, I don't think of you as belonging to this group that I assume is incompatible with being a person. In the same way that people will be surprised that I apparently have a US accent when I speak English, which is just racist, right? Or that people are surprised that I can accomplish something because I'm young. There's an assumption that the only people who count as not just fully human, but as deserving respect socially or professionally are white, cisgender, heterosexual, non-disabled men. So if you happen to be something other than that, and you are perceived as not the worst possible stereotypes of the groups that you belong to, then our society will say that the way to be complimented is to be dissociated from your community. To say, well, I can't possibly conceive of someone being both trans and someone that I should respect. So I will treat this person as not actually belonging to that group. I can't think of someone as being both disabled and someone that I think of as an actual human. So I'm going to categorize them in my head as not belonging to that disability group over there. And, for me, when people say that, I will often just respond with, well, what makes you say that? What if you could tell?
Yeah, way to put somebody on the spot. That's the kind of question that nobody's ever going to have a good answer to, because you're right. The answer is that I have a negative perception of that group, so I've disassociated you from it.
And the only reasons that someone will be dissociated from it are still based in ableism or racism or anti-transness, whatever it is, right? Which is, well, I think of you as not criminal, not sexually deviant, not stupid. That's why I don't want to think of you as that group, which reveals the underlying belief that person has rooted in broader racism, broader transmesia, or broader ableism, that the people who are actually people of color, whether Black, brown, Native, Asian, or mixed race, the people that are actually disabled, whether autistic or otherwise, the people that are actually trans, right, are those things. That's the expectation. That's the assumption. So going back to the question that you asked, how has this affected me? Well, in the same way that it's affected all of us, right? But in my own particular experience, because none of us are cisgender white men, none of us fall into the category of people assumed to possibly be autistic. Because autism only becomes visible or recognizable in society if it is associated with a straight white man, and more specifically with a straight white little boy. And if you are not that, then you're not going to be considered in the category of people that might be autistic, only in the context where autism here means autism will be responded to with the medicalized or pity-based model of, oh, you need help of some kind. When we're seen as a behavior problem or just weird or make people uncomfortable, or you're a problem because of your race or you're a problem because of your gender, then we're not going to be thought of even from that other ableist of you need help in the most patronizing medicalized way either. Instead, it will be a different form of pathologization. There are two sides of the same coin, but they manifest differently according to race, class, gender, and other aspects of identity and experience.
Okay, Lydia, I'm going to need you to write a book, okay? And just let me know when it's published. I'll read it. I have a feeling everyone else in this event will want to read it too, because you have a lot of thoughts pretty well developed on the intersection of these identities. And I wish I could pick your brain more. But in the interest of time, we are going to address some of these audience questions. And there are two people who have submitted a few questions. There's one that I want all of my panelists to answer in the group chat. So the question from Sophie about, do you have any favorite creators, readings, films, podcasts you'd recommend to seek out more information about autism and its intersections? If you know of anything, put that in the chat. And those recommendations will be there. And then for the questions Caroline submitted, we're going to do something of a speed round. So if you had to answer, and I'll go through these three, if you had to answer this question in 2 to 3 sentences, and it might be possible to you can connect to any of these individuals on Instagram, I believe. Lydia, I don't know if you're on Instagram, but anyway, you might could follow up there if you have further questions. But let's do quick answers. The first question from Caroline is, have you ever had people not believe you're autistic, and how did you deal with it? So, did you try and convince them? Did you let them believe that? Like, what is your typical response if or when that's happened? What do you think, Rachel?
Yeah, I've had a lot of people not believe that I'm autistic, and they still do. So it's frustrating, but it's also fun to mess with people.
So you'll make a little bit of a joke out of it. Well,
Yeah.
hey, when someone else is clearly clueless, it's not a bad idea to keep it lighthearted instead of feeling really upset, which is the other direction you could take it. Lauren, what have you done in that situation? Or if it hasn't, I feel like it's happened to you as well, but if it hasn't, what would you do?
In situations where this has happened to me, I immediately use it as an opportunity to educate people, because if they're going to tell me that they don't know, then it's time to tell them what they can know. Yeah, but I find different ways of addressing it, and depending on the person, I try to fill out their feel, their vibe, their intention, and we go from there.
Yeah, I agree that that's most often the path I take, is based on what their intention seems to be. Like, do they seem receptive to learning something? Do they seem like, no, this is how it is? I like to try and teach someone something. I've gotten mixed responses, but anyway. Okay, Lydia, what do you think about that question?
This is Lydia. Which question were we responding to?
It's the first one Caroline submitted. So if you've had people not believe you're autistic, how did you deal with that? And this is our speed round of questions. So if you had to sum up in a few sentences how you've addressed it when someone has sort of disbelieved your diagnosis.
I mean, it's really contextual. In many cases, does it really matter? Is it my responsibility, or do I care if this person believes me or not? If they are the person responsible for disability accommodations that I'm requesting, it probably matters. If they're a random stranger, does it really matter if this stranger believes me? I don't necessarily want to waste my time and energy in trying to convince this person that, yes, I am autistic, because it's frankly not their business.
Well put. Okay, so we don't have to educate everybody. Sometimes they're not worth your time, because kind of like with other minority identities, it's not your responsibility to educate everybody else about your community. Okay, next speed round question. What was stepping into your identities like? And that's a very broad question. I would answer it by saying, particularly when I found out I was on the spectrum, there was this moment of, do I tell no one or do I tell everyone? And I was like, of course I tell everyone. How do I hide this, when instead I could be breaking people's misconceptions and advocating and learning from other people by sharing about myself. So after making that decision, it was easy to step in that direction, but it was sort of a big moment figuring that out. Rachel, what has been your experience stepping into your own identities, both as an autistic person and with gender and sexuality?
Well, I always knew I was autistic because I was diagnosed at 3 years old. So stepping into that was really natural because I had it my whole life. And I guess sexuality and identity was sort of up and down. I knew that something was sort of different, that I was different from other girls. I didn't want to wear dresses or do girly things. And even throughout my life, I tell my mom, I'm a boy. And she's like, no, you're not. And I'm like, how do you know? And she just goes away. But it's been a whirlwind. I still have to accept it. It's really new to me. I mean, the pronouns, they just came about a month ago because I've been so scared. And I can definitely relate. I know Lydia was talking about the fundamentalist Christian parents, but I went to a Pentecostal school from 5th to 8th grade. And I feel like that put me in the closet quite a bit because there's a lot of gender roles in a place like that.
I
So,
was raised in a Pentecostal church, and at one point I was in a very evangelical oriented Christian school.
oh my God, well, that happened. And I mean, that can really take a toll on you in accepting your identity, even though it seemed like forever ago, it always stays in your heart. So the best thing to do is just own it. Love yourself first.
Wow. Again, a message of complete and utter confidence from Rachel. Thank you. All right. And the good news is we only have one question after this. So I think we're going to have time to do that one as well after this one. But Lauren, you're up to answer in a few sentences, what was stepping into your identities like?
This is Lauren Melissa, and stepping into my identities is an interesting concept because to me, identity is very fluid. And I don't think that there was a point that I just stepped into one of those identities and that was like there and I was there and then it never changed. And I never, I guess, grew or maybe not even grew, but sometimes I had steps back in accepting myself as well. And I think identity is I have so many identities, so it's hard to really pin that one down because they do intersect. I would say in terms of my queer identity and coming out as a lesbian and then as a romantic asexual and then as, myself, whoever I want to be. I just say queer these days. That was my first coming out because I didn't know that I was autistic. And so I came out at that time when I was in college and I was in undergrad, and that was a big deal for me. But then I had to come out again and again and again as I was trying to grow and understand my own identities. And I think that I've just reached a point now where I'm kind of a little exhausted by needing to explain my sexual identity in a way that people can understand, when in all honesty, who I love and how I love and what genders I love and all of that, like that's between me and the person I'm dating or the person I'm seeing. And currently right now it's between me and my partner. So then in terms of being autistic and stepping into my autistic identity, I would say I can definitely say that when I found a traits list of female traits, is how it was put. It was an eye opener for me. And then when I received a diagnosis, I I cried. I cried out of relief because I was so happy to know that I guess I should have known before, but it helped me to know that I wasn't broken, that I'm not broken. And I don't really think there are any broken people. But for me, stepping into my autistic identity really helped me to come to a place of understanding that I'm not a broken person and that I am whole.
Well, and that makes me think of Lydia's statement. I think it was on a pin they were wearing about like, there's no wrong way to have a body. So those ideas there of there being all these rules out there, but a lot of them are arbitrary. And sometimes living by them is restrictive and doesn't allow you to embrace what you feel like is the truest sense of yourself, who you want to love, who you want to be, and how you want to be a member of this world. Okay, so Lydia, over to you about what was stepping into your identities like. And then after that, we will do our wrap up question of, did you have a period of unmasking? So that'll be the next question. And I'll just get informationally, we'll gather from each of you, like that was something you went through or it really wasn't. But go ahead, Lydia.
This is Lydia. I can answer both those questions at the same time, which is a lifelong process. Figuring out what makes sense to me about who I am and how I move through the world, and discovering words that sometimes fit me a little bit better, but not perfectly, and other times really matched who I am. And just in the process of growing and learning and being alive, not always having the same outlook or the same way of framing things or understanding things now as I did in the past. And even the way that I've talked about myself today, I might look back at this in 5 years and I might be using very different language then. And that doesn't mean that I was wrong about who I am today. It just means that, like all people, our understanding of ourselves can be in flux. It doesn't change who we are. It doesn't mean we're wrong. It doesn't mean we're not valid. It doesn't mean we don't deserve support. But what we know about ourselves, how and what and how much of that we choose to share with other people, and how we choose to live our lives is always going to be different. And for me, one major part of that has just living as best as I can to be authentic to myself, because I am long past the point of trying to suppress who I am just to make other people feel comfortable.
Yes, and I will say to the unmasking question, because that's what we're going to end on here. I think a lot of it was, what does it mean to be autistic, Claire, and not Claire who's pretending not to be autistic? And I started being willing to speak up about my needs, to say, like, this sensory thing is bothering me. Can we change it? Or this is an accommodation that would be helpful. So for me, that was a big part of not just pretending to be like everybody else all the time. Rachel, I know you were diagnosed early. Did you have any period of you felt like you were being really more authentic as an autistic person? Or is that something that you've always gotten to do, is just because you knew that about yourself, was to live it out?
I feel like I always got to do that because everyone knew there was something wrong with me. I know that sounds really terrible, but I mean, that's what I grew up hearing, that there was something wrong. We need to get her fixed. And then I heard the term autism and it just clicked, like, this is what I have and this is how I'm going to be in the world. Even though it's hard, I'm going to grow with it. But I don't really think, because of that, I don't think I masked. There were points where, especially in middle school, I just wanted to have friends and I wanted to be normal, but I didn't really get to be normal because I was different than everyone else. And it was hard to be normal. So I just accepted what was, I
Well,
guess.
and Rachel, you point out one of the reasons that masking happens is the first place, is that a lot of times people just want to be seen as one of the community. And so in some sense, you've been very genuine because you've never masked much, but in another sense, there have been times when you didn't feel like you fit in. So that is a multi-sided experience. And we will wrap up with Lauren's answer to that question of, do you feel like you ever unmasked?
This is Lauren Melissa, and I have definitely unmasked, and I'm still unmasking, and it is a process. When I was diagnosed at 23, I decided to sit with myself and to acknowledge the things that were overstimulating me, the things that were bothering me, the things that I wanted to say, the things that I wanted to express, the way that I wanted to stem. I decided to start embracing those things, and I received a lot of pushback from my loved ones telling me that I needed to stop acting a certain way because I thought I was this thing. And I had to fight against that narrative in order to discover myself. And I'm still fighting against that narrative today. But I've come to a much stronger place where I know that the more and more I unmask, the more and more I can learn to care for myself, embrace myself, and express myself. And that is a reward.
You guys are so insightful. I've been learning from listening to all three of you. And the questions that our audience members asked were excellent. Thank you so much to everyone who showed up today. And thank you to my panelists for being vulnerable and talking about your experiences as members of the autistic community and as people who have gone through your own processes of gender and sexual identity and what that's been like. If you have any interest in attending future Autistic Pride Month events that the Frist Center is hosting, you can visit at Autism and Innovation, our Instagram page, and you will find more information there on our future events. There will be at least 5 more throughout the month of April. I'm really excited about our very last one, actually. It'll be featuring one of the 3 openly autistic politicians in our country. And there goes my dog barking. I think that's a good note to sign off on. It has been a pleasure to get to have all of you here with us, and we'll see you at future events.